I began my boating days as a small boy during the holidays on the coast of Arran, which to the west of Scotland. We had a fairly tough rowing boat which could carry at least 6 people and required a good deal of strength to row. In the early days, I was given 1 oar and managed to avoid losing it overboard. Most of our boating time was spent in fishing, deep sea in the evening, and trawling with a fly by day. One regular duty, however, was to fetch the rolls from the bakery 2 miles away, and this was done by 2 of us every morning about 7 o'clock. In the course of time, as I gained strength, I became more independent, and on one occasion I tried to row across the Kilbrannan Sound to the Kintyre coast. I got halfway and lost the Isle of Arran on the horizon, but as the day was drawing on, I came to the conclusion it was better to turn back, which I did and got home by nightfall. Later on, I wanted to have a sail, and at first this consisted of some sacks sewn together and was good enough for running downwind, but not for going to windward. Then I managed to get a proper sail, and it was great fun sailing this boat instead of having to row. I went abroad at an early date, and the only sailing that I was able to do was in the Himalayan lakes in India, and this was quite exciting. During periods of leave from India, I sailed quite a bit in the Solent, and then the urge came to go abroad, and I used to sail across with other people to France and the Channel Islands. When I had finished with service abroad, I settled down in Leamington and acquired various boats. About that time, I was skipper of the Royal Air Force Transport Command yacht, in which I used to take parties of airmen and women for 10 days cruising along the Channel. Most of them did very well and became quite efficient crews. The occasion then arose for me to sail in Virtue 35 from Leamington to New York in 47.5 days. She was a small boat, and this was quite an exciting adventure, as there were 10 gales and a double hurricane on the way, ending up in the ship being thrown over and broken open. We managed to patch up the holes in the boat and continue the voyage to America. After a short time, a steamer appeared on the horizon, and I was extremely glad to be able to get my position from him, as we had no means of navigation after the accident. I decided then to make for the nearest deep-water coastline in New Jersey. But a thick fog settled down, and one could see nothing. Suddenly, a hole appeared in the fog, and there I saw great waves breaking on the beach, which I thought at first must be the West Indies. I sailed some distance along this coast, and presently came on a large building with the name Long Branch Stadium on it. So I had a landfall at 150 yards, 4,000 miles from England. I kept along the coast, not daring to leave it, and after a while got to the approaches of New York Harbor, and there the first ship that came near us had my own name on it, Kevin Moran, and belonged to some distant connections of mine. After this, I continued up to the New York River, and there in the distance saw the Liberty Statue. We sailed up among the skyscrapers, which were then coming on into light, but found no place to tie up until there appeared an opening in the wall, and we went in there and tied up alongside. It turned out to be the American Navy yard, and it wasn't long before a lot of sentries started challenging and rattling their guns at us. When eventually I had speech with one of their sentries, I showed him that we had just come from England, and he could see that the sails were still up. After that, a crowd of naval officers boarded the ship and tapped her all over for bombs, but finding nothing, told us that we must stay there the night. And this is exactly what we wanted to do, as we hadn't had a proper night's sleep all the way across the ocean. In the morning, a gang of officials arrived. Doctors, customs, immigration. The first two were easily satisfied, but the immigration officer wanted full particulars. When he had finished with the owner of the boat, he then turned to me and said, "What's this?" And he was assured that I was the crew and the navigator. So he prepared a crew list for us, and then I said, "Now can I go ashore?" He said, "No, you've got to swear to this." So I said, "Let's go and swear." But he said, "You can't swear without landing." And I said, "What happens if I do land?" He says, "You'll be fined $5,000. Well, I said, "I've only got £5 English money on me." He said, "Well, then you'll go to jail." We weren't making much progress, and then it occurred to me that I had a passport. So I produced that. It was pretty weather-beaten, and showed it to him. And after he had looked at it, he became almost crestfallen and said, "I had no idea who you were. You can go ashore any time and stay in America as long as you like." Having got the freedom from America, we retired below. But it wasn't long before we were aware of a tremendous gang of press photographers up on the dock side, flashing at us. There were about 12 of them in 3 rows, one behind the other. When they were satisfied and had to go off to deal with some other important event, we then began to get ready to leave, because the American naval officers said that they wanted our berth to moor a battleship. So we sailed up the New York River under sail, because there was no engine on board, for 30 miles until eventually we got up to the shipyard where we were to tie up. And we were met by the crew of the great ship Yankee, who very kindly did all our tidying up for us and tied us alongside their big ship. We were welcomed on board, and there were a large number of prospective passengers to welcome us. And there we sat down to an enormous meal, the first proper meal I'd seen since leaving England. In front of me was a jug of water, and the owner of Yankee said, "I'm sorry that we're a dry ship." And I had some visions of his being a leaking ship. But what he really meant was they only had fresh water on board. So I said, "Could I have some?" Because I'd only had half a cup of water a day for the last 47 days. He said, "Oh, yes," and I helped myself liberally to this jug of water. And it wasn't long before I'd finished it. And I said, "Could I have another jug of water?" And he said, "Oh, yes." I said, "I hope you're not short of fresh water." He said, "Oh, no, we've got 9 tons on board and we're connected to the New York water supply." So having been assured that he had enough water on board, I helped myself a bit more liberally. In the course of the next 2 hours, I must have drunk about 2 quarts of water. We stayed on board this great ship, and next morning the question arose about washing. And I found a small bathtub, and I got into that, and for the first time for all these days, had a sit-down bath, and it seemed almost criminal. Among our visitors was a very tall American yachtsman who had great difficulty in getting inside Virtue 35 and was glad enough to get out and suggested to me that I might go sailing in their yacht, which was a bit bigger than ours. Turned out to be America's #1 racing yacht, an enormous ship, and I spent a very pleasant week sailing up Long Island Sound. The time came, however, when I had to think of getting back to England, and through the good offices of the Moran Towing Transportation Company, I was able to get a berth on Queen Mary and had a very smooth passage the whole way back to England, quite in contrast to the outward passage with the hurricanes. On board, I had a continual train of photographers admiring me. And at Southampton, the press didn't take long in filling up my cabin and photographing me and taking down my history. In due course, I got back to Leamington, and there I had the warmest welcome of the whole of the expedition. It was so nice to be able to assure our own people that we'd made a little bit of history for Leamington.